How's it going, everybody? Thanks for tuning in to another tier list video. For those of you that haven't been following me over on Twitch, I just recently went full-time with content creation, so please be sure to go over there and follow at twitch.tv/darthjacen. Also, if you're not subscribed to this YouTube channel, be sure to hit the like and subscribe button down below. About 70% of you who watch these videos every week are not subscribed. It's free and it helps me out a ton. Let's jump right in to this week's tier list. Normally I would have a section on F&M level decks, but for this week, in the transition of getting my new PC, moving to full-time, I didn't write out that list. However, I think most decks that are at least visible to some degree on the 5.0 list, the prelims or the challenges that aren't on this list are still in that F&M category. And for people going to RCQs and other tournaments this week, mostly you want to be focusing on the tiers above F&M. So for this week, we're going to start with D tier. Next week, F&M tier will return. Sorry about that, but that is the consequence of switching computers. Was a little bit behind this week. First up in D tier, we have Red Prowess. This is a deck that Todd Anderson brought to the forefront. It's a solid deck, but with the banning of Expressive Iteration, it's been seeing a downtick. People have been replacing Expressive with Of One Mind, which is a great addition, but I think the deck still lacks a little bit of the consistency to fight for a higher spot right now. Next up, we have Untitled, which has been impressing me as far as play goes. Recently put out a video on YouTube with a forerun with it. Deck is very strong at being able to answer some of these mid-range piles, but you do still run into the problem where some decks can go too far over the top of you. Combo is a problem like Lotus Field, and the aggro decks with discard can sometimes get under you. Next up, we have Blue-Red Creativity, another blue-red shell that was hit by the loss of Expressive Iteration. Aspiring Spike brought this deck to the forefront, using Indomitable Creativity to put out a bunch of Torrential Gearhulks before using those to outvalue your opponent with Magma Opus. If you followed me on Standard and Explorer, you know how much I love Opus as a card. Just one of the biggest X for ones you can do. Doing it for free is even better. So I think this is a solid deck, but it's not impressive enough in that it can still lose pretty regularly to things like Dovin's Veto, Hand Disruption, and Interaction that turns off your graveyard. Next up, we have Greasefang. The various Greasefang decks didn't put up very good showings this week. I think they've sort of coalesced back to around the same strength with Abzan, Esper, and Mardu. I actually think Abzan is starting to pull ahead a little bit. I like some of the builds I've seen, but as far as the results go and where they sit in the metagame, they all sort of congeal together here in the D tier. Next up, we have Bant Spirits, which is probably in that middle spot of the Spirits. I think Blue-Eyed Spirits kind of not really showing up right now. Mono Blue Spirits showing up to try and fight some of the higher decks, but even having some weak showings. But Bant Spirits has been showing up. The benefit of Spell Queller, Collected Company, able to fight some of these mid-range decks and keep yourself in the game even through the removal. But with the top decks in the format all using very cheap interaction, especially red and black interaction, it does make it tough to have your synergy-based creature deck really hold much weight in the metagame. Like usual, we're going to jump right to the top, but this week there is no S tier. We've seen a lot of parity between the top two decks, and while they are sort of, as far as finishes go, a step above, when we just look at the challenges and sort of the higher level play right now, it's very close between the A and B tier decks, and a lot of that I think has to do with the vacuum that Mono Green created from being the top deck to suddenly disappearing. So first up, we have Red Black Midrange. This is a deck that consistently shows up, puts up strong results, doesn't always win the challenges in the weekend, doesn't always put up a lot of top 8s, but it's consistently at the top tables, interacts favorably against all the creature decks, and is able to keep a lot of the linear aggro decks in check. Where you tend to struggle is with the over-the-top decks, things like Niv-to-Light, Mono Green, and things like Blue-Red Phoenix and Blue-White have very close matchups depending on how you build each of those decks. I think Red-Black is solid, but I think it is probably one small step, not enough to be in its own tier, but one tiny step behind the other A tier deck, and that is It Phoenix? To me, It Phoenix has looked like the best deck in Pioneer for the last week or two. 2. We've seen a lot talked about and written about with this deck, putting up another 6 finishes. Adding in Thing in the Ice with Ledger Shredder and Phoenix is a great creature threat base, and the over-the-top spells, cantrips, and delve spells give you a great late game paired with your early game interaction of your red spells. One of the ways that this deck was able to reach its success was knocking mono green out of the format to a degree, thanks to Disdainful Stroke, Aether Gust, and just large creatures like Thing in the Ice, Flip, and Crackling Drake out of the sideboard, immediately applying pressure onto mono green after killing their early threats. Next up, we have the B tier. These are the decks that I think are solid choices. They did, in fact, win both challenges this weekend, and I think a lot of where they sit between A or B has to do with the decks above them and with their overall consistency among the rest of the challenge. First up, we have Blue-White Control. Put up a strong finish, only one challenge top 16 behind the A tier decks. What I like about Blue-White Control right now is that you are able to customize your deck between the 60 and 80 card version. If you want to try and attack the more aggressive linear strategies, you go 60 cards. More mid-range or control, you go 80. You have access to a lot of the best sideboard cards in the format, and you're able to really attack the A tier decks. But where you struggle is some of the more low to the ground linear decks, things like Mono Blue Spirits, and you also really struggle into a rising deck in Lotus Field that has picked up a lot of percentages since Mono Green has been losing. Lotus Field was one of the reasons that Blue-White stopped being a really popular deck a little while ago, and with Lotus Field winning both challenges this weekend, it's clear to see that if Lotus Field continues to pick up, Blue-White has a hard ceiling as to how high it can go. Next up, let's move on to Lotus Field. Like I said, it won both challenges. Very strong performance, win 2 challenges in a weekend with different pilots. To me, Lotus Field is a great meta choice. When Mono Green was around, it's tough because the power of Karn making it tough to win with your combo, but they've added in extra natural states, 3 Besejus, 2 Otawara, and a Blast Zone. A lot of ways to interact with the hate pieces out of green to give you a much closer matchup. And then you have a strong matchup into Blue-Red Phoenix, Red-Black mid-range, assuming you have some number of Leyline of Sanctities or are just able to operate around their discard. And then Blue-White is a great matchup. The biggest problem you have is that decks like Heroic, Mono Blue Spirits, Mono Red still exist, Humans exist, and you can get aggroed out, but with enough consistency and good options out of your sideboard, I think there are ways to make your deck good against enough of the field that unless we see more aggro coming up, which would mean that Red, Black, and Phoenix would need to fall down. Lotus also has a bit of a hard cap, but if you run into the more mid-range controlling decks in the later rounds of the tournament, you are a favorite to make a deep run. Last up in B tier, we have Boros Heroic. This is the aggro deck du jour. I think it does a very good job of interacting well with some of these 1-for-1 decks in Red, Black mid-range and Blue-Red Phoenix, being able to get your creature out of range of damage spells and then being able to protect it with God's Willing is a very powerful effect. I think Illuminator Virtuoso is exactly the kind of card that a deck like this needs to punish the more non-interactive decks like Mono Green. And while I think you struggle against something like Blue-White, being able to fight a close matchup against Blue-Red, a little bit of an underdog against Red-Black to be fair, but with things like Showdown of the Scald and other sideboard cards, you can try and extend your game plan. But where you're most favored as far as where I like this deck in the metagame is that against decks that aren't super well tuned, aren't super well constructed to attack linear decks like Heroic, you're able to ask questions very aggressively, and if your opponent ever stumbles on an answer, you just get to kill them. Next up, we have the C tier, and this week I think the C tier is mostly comprised of decks that have been a little bit higher in the past, and honestly I think what we're seeing is that the meta continues to shift and some of these top decks have started to fall. First up, we have Mono Blue Spirits. With the loss of another C tier deck in Mono Green, we saw one of the main reasons that people were playing Mono Blue start to fall. You really don't want to be playing Spirits in a world where everyone has 1 to 2 mana cheap red and black interaction, and I think Mono Blue Spirits has been taking a loss due to that change in the metagame. Mono Green, like we said, first time since the banning was 0 top 32s in either challenge. This was a really rough weekend for Mono Green. Honestly, it feels like the deck still is powerful, but Red Black midrange has started adapting to make it harder. Though you're still favored, the matchup gets closer and closer. Blue Red Phoenix feels like it's unfavored in post board games or if an early thing comes down. Blue-white control is still a buy. Lotus Field is not as good as it was for you. And Heroic and Mono Blue Spirits are still tough, with humans being a close matchup. I think everyone put a target on mono green. People changed their decks drastically to target it. As people continue to rotate through this metagame, we might see green become a positionally good choice once again. But right now, you just don't want to be playing Elvish Mystic. I think it's just tough to bring it to a big event where most of the format is going to have very cheap, very consistent interaction for it. Next up, we have humans. These are, again, we've had a ton of variations. Honestly, I've seen mono white, Band, White Black, Esper, 4-color, 5-color Pyre. So it's hard to really break down all of the individual ones. For me, I think Mono White and Bant are the two best. That's where I'd be looking if I was starting with humans and then looking at the 4 or 5-color Pyre version. I think humans is in a good spot where it gets to have a lot of adaptation and changes based on the metagame. Mono White is very aggressive and more resilient than it looks. Bant has more interaction for other creature decks, and the litany of humans decks is probably going to be something where you can change it week to week which version you are, and that will give you a better shot at attacking the metagame. Last up, we have Rakdos Sacrifice. I think the new builds of Sacrifice are much stronger, especially in dodging Karn the Great Creator. I think they're very good at being able to stop the various aggro creature decks, being able to put Cat Oven together as well as various removal spells. Where you're going to suffer is against Blue-Red Phoenix and any of the over-the-top decks that can deal with your card advantage engines. I think attacking Rakdos mid-range with Rakdos Sacrifice is a great idea, but I think a lot of the other top matchups are a lot closer with Sacrifice, and you don't have a real way to close the game out quickly. So if you give enough time to decks like Lotus Field or Blue-White, you tend to run into problems. Same with Phoenix. So there you have it. That's the tier list for this week. A little bit shorter than normal. Again, appreciate everyone being understanding of changing over PCs, having to redo some images, and getting some work done. But we'll be back with an FNM tier next week. Appreciate everyone hanging out. Until next time.